Hi, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's virtual event with Brookline Booksmith, featuring Jeff VanderMeer and Dr. Meghan Brown discussing Hummingbird Salamander in conversation with Carl Zimmer. My name is Bree, and I'm the Assistant Events Director at Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Mass. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back, and if this is your first time hearing about us, welcome. We're very happy to have all of you join our community this afternoon, and we appreciate your support of the author and an independent bookstore through your purchases and attendance. The chat and question box are open down here at the bottom of Zoom, so feel free to make use of those. Remember to set your chat to all panelists and attendees so that you can talk to other people in the audience. And if you do have questions, please drop them in the Q&A box. I have a feeling the chat's going to be moving pretty quickly, and we don't want to miss any of your great questions. Please note that Brookline Booksmith has a strict policy against abusive behavior and language, and at our discretion, any attendee can be removed from an event for partaking in such behavior. Carl Zimmer is the author of 14 books about science. His latest book is Life's Edge, the search for what it means to be alive. His column Matter appears each week in the New York Times. She Has Her Mother's Laugh, another of his most recent books, was named a Best Science Book of 2018 by The Guardian. Zimmer is a familiar voice on radio programs such as Radiolab and professor adjunct at Yale University. Dr. Meghan Brown is a biology professor at Hobart and William Smith College in Geneva, New York, where she studies and teaches about the critical role humans play in shaping Earth. Her nonfiction publications address questions such as, how does climate change impact organisms in mountain lakes? Did Cuba's revolution shape its modern ecology? What role do non-native species play in conservation of vulnerable environments? And she is a Fulbright Fellow at National Science Foundation Guarantee and a recently featured scientist in National Geographic. And Jeff VanderMeer. He has been called the Weird Thoreau by the New York Times and once wrote a little book I think you probably all know called Annihilation, with a tower tunnel in it that became a bestseller and a movie. His work documenting the dystopian adventures of giant flying bears, talking plants, and blue foxes in Bourne, The Strange Bird, and Dead Astronauts has won not only readers, but also the Shirley Jackson and Nebula Awards. Although in his own words, his crowning achievement is having once helped a giant snapping turtle cross a busy highway in a thunderstorm while it crapped all over him in thanks. He spent the last 3 years making his yard into a wildlife sanctuary and is deeply involved in political and environmental issues in North Florida. He currently serves on the board of the Apalachicola Riverkeepers, is involved in a progressive nonprofit, and writes a monthly Wild Tallahassee column for the local paper. His new novel, Hummingbird Salamander, performs the astonishing feat of existing in the past, the present, and our immediate future. It also has a lot of hummingbirds and salamanders in it. It's a pleasure to have them all with us here this afternoon, so please join me in welcoming Carl Zimmer, Dr. Meghan Brown, and Jeff VanderMeer. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Well, thanks so much for having us all. So I have to say, having just finished reading the book this week, I'm almost in a way reluctant to talk about it, except to say you should just go read it. I for one am not going to be giving away. I'm going to be doing my best not to give away any spoilers. Jeff, you wrote the thing, so you can choose to give away as you see fit. But I think what we're going to be talking about, especially today, is sort of the process of world building for a book like this, and in particular for Jeff, the process of animal building, which is what Meghan is going to be talking about as well, because when you read this book, if you haven't already, you will see that there are animals that feature very prominently, including ones that essentially made from scratch. So Jeff, maybe we could start just by hearing from you a little bit about, what the seed of this book was, like how we can sort of work our way to your collaboration with Meghan where do we start? Oh, you're on mute.
We actually start at Hobart and William Smith colleges, where Dr. Meghan Brown is a professor. And I was talking to an environmental activism class there, and they had read Annihilation, and their response was, yeah, but we would like something more direct about the environment, some of them. And I appreciated their honesty. And I also appreciated it myself because I do feel the urgency of the moment with regard to climate crisis. So, I put that in the back of my head. How can I, as a novelist, in a non-didactic way, be more direct? And one thing that came out was my last novel, Dead Astronauts, which is very much formally experimental, and a kind of prose poetry coats the environmental message in such a way that it's not didactic. And the other is Hummingbird Salamander, which is using the format or form or genre of psychological thriller, and has an environmental puzzle or mystery at the heart of it with regard to this dead eco-activist who gifts the main character Jane with a piece of taxidermy, which is a extinct hummingbird. And so I thought that this was an amazing setup for kind of supercharging actual information, which is to say Jane has to wade through a lot of incoming intel, a lot of it about the environment, to figure out what the intent was of this woman in giving her this quote unquote gift. And so instead of the exposition being just backstory or lecture-y, it's actually, I think, much more about Jane's awakening to environmental issues, the mystery, and then also to some extent how she becomes very enamored of the hummingbird and its journey, its migration, I think in part because, of course, it has a connection to this woman who has given it to her. And in terms of the actual novel, where it came from, I had the first line about, I'm probably dead by the time you write this. And then this image in my head of this tiny hummingbird in this enormous hand. And that spoke to me about the physicality of the character. Jane is very strong, a very large woman. And I like the juxtaposition of those two things, the delicacy of the hummingbird and the non-delicacy of the human.
So, how did you and Meghan start to collaborate? You have this sort of seed of an idea with a hummingbird. Did you say, like, now I need to find a biologist, or where do we go from there?
Well, just from my point of view, it was more that it's actually a good question, because normally I would write a draft and then I would layer in stuff like that. But here I felt I needed it ahead of time. So Meghan may be able to speak more closely to the timeline, because I don't actually even remember when it entered the novel. I just know that I had only written, like, I think 20 pages before she had come up with the material. So
yeah, Meghan, maybe Meghan, before we go further, could you talk a little bit about your own work as a scientist?
Sure. I'm an ecologist, and most of what I study is in the aquatic realm. I'm interested in questions about how species make it to lakes, and when they establish there, what type of interactions they have with other organisms. And sometimes I study other places depending on what the question is. I also do a lot of teaching. So Hobart and William Smith is a place that values a teacher-scholar model. So I end up kind of having a pretty strong symbiosis between what I'm working on in terms of my science and what I'm working on with my students. So that might have been kind of this moment for Jeff and I. When he was on campus, I invited him to come out on a research cruise. We have a vessel on Seneca Lake, and it's a pretty normal, natural part of college students' life here, especially science students, to go out on the vessel. And sometimes I have research students that spend a lot of time there. And quite a bit of the work that I do happens at night. And there are organisms that only come out at night. And so
like what?
Like actually the shrimp behind me here is an opossum shrimp that's native to these deep glacial lakes of the Great Lakes region. And we were going out to collect that actually. And I said, Jeff, you should come along. You know, I had also just read Annihilation and thought that he might get a kick out of, you know, a group of biologists going out into the night. And, you know, it was like a regular trip for us, but I think it was really obvious to me all of a sudden, these really nuanced ways in which we were working that were odd to the outsider. Like, for example, we could only use red light because of the sensitivity of the organisms we were working with. And so all the pictures from that night have this red glow that's present there. So there were a lot of small moments where Jeff and I were interacting and talking about science in New York, but also about the role that fiction plays in teaching science. And, you know, sometimes it's really helpful for me to grab, you know, something from, you know, Margaret Atwood or Octavia Butler in a science class to get students really in the mindset of what I'm trying to teach them that is nonfiction. I actually also don't quite remember the moment that Jeff asked me to develop the species, but first he asked me to do the salamander. So it was a moment of time in which I do remember that, and I was working on the salamander for a while, and then I took on the added piece of the hummingbird. So they were developed separately, very much from one another. I didn't do them, you know, I did them in lockstep.
So Jeff, so why was it so important? I mean, you know, there are lots of salamanders out there. Why did you need a new one?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I actually got in trouble. There's a couple of things. There's the trauma that from when I created my own freshwater squid. So maybe I wanted to attribute it to someone else. I created a freshwater squid for Florida, so I could do kind of a send up of small Florida festivals. So there was a festival, the freshwater squid set in Sebring, and I wrote a short story about it. And unfortunately, people thought it was real and started bombarding Sebring's Chamber of Commerce with calls. I actually got a call from a BBC wildlife program asking if I would go down. So anyway, long story short, I had already had kind of a thing where I had created a fake species. But I think here, I really wanted to have a little bit of a distance from the real world. So, for example, I also don't use the name of the president, even though it's, you know, kind of a novel that's set, you know, prior to this year and then goes into the just vaguely into the future. There's other details that are not, you know, there because I think there's a certain distance required from the present moment to kind of speak to the present moment. But I also felt that, especially like with the hummingbird, there's emotion that I attached to it from the real world because of having had a formative experience in Cusco where I was really sick and I had a kind of a hallucinogenic experience when I was 8 and saw these hummingbirds against this mountainside and couldn't be sure if they were real or not. And that actually really affected my writing. It was kind of like a mystery or a moment that made me want to write. So I needed some distance from that myself. And then I thought it's still a book that, unlike the prior books, is realism. So I want the facts to be correct. And I could research it myself. I could use a real one. But I thought that there was something interesting about using the constraint of someone else coming up with the salamander. And given the fact, again, that like you don't get the names of cities, you don't get those kinds of landmarks, to have it be something that's made up but plausible made sense as well. So I also wanted my main character Jane to react to I wanted myself as the writer and Jane as the character to react to this information. And it was a lot easier to do that if I didn't come up with it myself, because I would already know it when I'm writing those scenes, if that makes sense. So I think I actually withheld some of the information from myself until I was writing certain scenes, so that I would kind of have Jane's reaction, not mine, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So Megan, so how do you make a salamander from scratch?
Yeah, so the salamander in the book is in the genus Plethowin, which doesn't exist, but in my mind, the best described species in that genus is the road newt, Plethowin omina. And, you know, in designing it, you are thinking about its analogs in nature. It had to obey things like thermodynamics and evolution. You're also thinking about its environment and where it's situated. And for me, that was easier for the salamander than the hummingbird because, really long back in elementary school, salamanders were kind of seeped from Mr. Park's class in my head. And, so there's some things in the book that are kind of borrowed from that. In fact, the salamander, the species name is Omina, which is a place not very far from where I grew up. And it also is a word that likely came from the Ojibwe, and it means, is this really true? So there's definitely roots there. And then for sure, part of the phenomenon that I study and find interesting are present. There's aspects of dormancy. Part of my work explores ideas of, when and why organisms put life on pause, either slowing their metabolism or respiration in ways that I'm really curious about. So that's present in the book. There's also an element of the kind of duality between non-native species, which are also a thread of my work, and extinct or threatened species. They're really on the same coin. Non-native species are ones that are thriving in human manipulated landscape, yet we find them undesirable. Either they're causing ecological harm or economic damage, or, we don't like their aesthetics. And so that was fun to play with as well, as I was creating these two species that were threatened species or extinct species, yet what I, am constantly seeped in my world is species that are thriving in those landscapes. I also wanted there to be, fantastic elements. So the salamander has the common name road newt, and it's so named because it has a double yellow line running down its spine. And this was, perhaps natural selection working on, a population that was experiencing fragmentation due to roads. So I don't know, a little bit of, giving a middle finger to roads and fragmentation and interfering with foraging and migration. So there are elements there. The hummingbird has the word naiad in it. So naiads are, hominids that are, found around water and they can fly. This is not a body plan that has been successfully found on Earth. So there's definitely some play there. But I would say that, it was really my experience as a scientist and as someone that was observing the world around me while I was creating it that was helpful. The hummingbird is an interesting one because serendipity had it that I ended up in the Andes and in British Columbia the year that I was developing the hummingbird. And so I was very much studying what were foreign landscapes to me as a practicing ecologist, but were the endpoints of the migration of the naiad hummingbird. So that was a really terrific to be able to have on the ground, research, if you will, for the naiad hummingbird.
Right. So why don't we have you guys do a little reading from the book, which actually has bearing on this. I believe, Jeff, you'll start.
Yeah, I will start. And I've actually been monitoring the chat just a little bit. So I actually have some winners of various things before we go. This is kind of a psychedelic version of the Unitopia commune. It's a disguised blueprint for this commune that's described in the book. And we also have this kind of fanciful stationery and some t-shirts. So I would just say, if I call your name, you just need to email me at the contact form on my website, jeffvandermeer.com. So Danny Redfern, Brett Smith, Eugene Leonard, Susan Lipman, and also Eduardo Martinez, who didn't actually say anything about the hummingbird, but he suggested my next book should be called Opossum Shrimp. So I really feel like that deserves something. So again, Danny Redfern, Brett Smith, Eugene Leonard, Susan Lipman, and Eduardo Martinez, and just email me from my website contact form, and we'll talk about what you've won. So this is early on in the novel, and Jane has just received the hummingbird, and she's kind of like looking at it as a physical object and then thinking about her relationship to animals. And then she's also already done some research and has, as you'll see, has kind of begun thinking about that. So I'll read this first portion and then Meghan will take over for me, basically where it begins to use the information that she wrote. And I included it just as she wrote it in the book. Were companies units or loose, ever-shifting alliances of individuals? Still didn't know. But I'd learned on the farm growing up that animals were not individuals, not persons, but groups, categories. Mother, father, grandfather told me this every day growing up. It was the most constant, repetitive lesson learned from the grown-ups in my family, in both word and action. This was the way of the world at large, perhaps with more callousness. On the farm, or at least our farm, you respected animals, but they also gave you eggs or milk or meat. Your goats had names, but one day you would slaughter them. You scratched the pigs on the coarse hair of their backs until they grunted with pleasure. You knew their personalities and habits. But then one morning your father would be helping put them in the back of a stranger's truck, and they'd be gone forever. On top of that, I'd had a decade of what Sylvina, who's the eco activist, called indoctrination. From raising a daughter who we encouraged to love YouTube videos with cute animals without once thinking about the context or source, animated movies where birds talked and smiled like people, and maybe the animal was the villain or maybe not, but it too talked and made faces and in every way tried to be part of the human world. That it distanced me from anything useful I might have known about animals, something not tested or something foundational where you should seek the exception, something toxic from the monoculture. So maybe at first the frisson of mystery and intrigue came from reading what I'd printed out while idling in the parking garage, doors locked before heading home, alert for anyone approaching.
Hummingbirds are aesthetic and aerobic extremists, read one website. Their tiny bodies hover akin to flying carpets. Did one just zip by? Hummers evolved high in the Andes Mountains with progressive colonization of lower altitudes and expanding latitudes, especially to the north and eventually to the far reaches of Canada and Alaska. They remain restricted to the Americas with the vast majority of the 300 plus species residents of South America. Sylvina wrote, "Information isn't story. No animal should be condensed to a summary in an encyclopedia." But all I had was information at first, and a dead bird's body, because that's all she'd given me. The naiad hummingbird, Celestrophes griffin, is of moderate size, less than 10 centimeters body length, with an especially long migration that delights the most diligent of birders across its range. Although difficult to find and observe by humans, the brilliant colors and patterns of the males are adaptations to catch the eyes of their mates. I had a large female specimen then, pitch black, no nonsense. They are fine athletes whose stunt repertoire includes backwards flight, treading in air, and maneuvering precisely in gusty wind, and whose migration between the Pacific Northwest and Argentina equates to several back-to-back ultramarathons. I tried to imagine traveling that far as an adaptation through so many different kinds of terrain. This was an epic journey, and one only allowed due to incredible specializations. The changes a human body would have to undergo to inhabit such places without equipment. Wouldn't they change your point of view too? Wouldn't you become someone else? Like many species that have northern skewed ranges for breeding, Celestrophes griffin is a snowbird and migrates closer to the phylogenetic nexus of hummingbirds in South America. S. griffin winters in the Andes, where of course it's actually summer. Oxygen is limited at these altitudes as well as during the bird's migration. Nonetheless, S. griffin maintains extraordinary metabolic rates that are enabled by adaptations to the hemoglobin protein that binds oxygen to iron. These changes to the heme group are inducible during their migration and winter in the Andes, but are not present during the summer at lower elevations in North America. But it wasn't just the journey, the flowers, the nest, all of it, once I had time to really immerse myself, caught up in a way I didn't expect. Not just because of the mystery, but the data, after all. Who wouldn't be moved by the details? Maybe it was just me, or maybe it was the flush of the first real intel. Status, unknown. The last documented observation was in the Stein Valley, Lokamopax Heritage Park, British Columbia. Ornithological groups are seeking information, photographic sightings, or recorded calls. Not just rare then, but presumed extinct, last seen in 2007. I felt a pang of emotion, as if this was a twist, but a twist that you could have seen coming. And after the pang, it took no time at all. That emotion began to recede from me. Couldn't hold on to it all the time, even though I tried. Self-inoculation. That month, the southern white rhino and a species of pangolin had gone extinct. Wildfires in 5 countries meant animals were crawling to the sides of roads to beg people speeding by in cars for water. People were poisoning vultures and shooting bats out of the sky, scared of pandemics. To care more meant putting a bullet in your brain. So like many, I learned to care less. Sylvania called it the fatal adaptation. I knew what she meant, but she was wrong. Alone with my thoughts, this was all unsettling, destabilizing. Excitement, joy, sadness, unease, and the briefest period. Even now, I can't truly explain the nexus of that and how it rippled through me.
Great. I just wanted to remind folks that we're going to talk a bit more and then take your questions. So there's lots of people posting in the chat, but for the questions, I will be taking a look at the Q&A box. So just throw your questions in there, and then I'll get to those, and we'll just go through as many as we can. So Jeff, so if I understand correctly, I mean, basically you're sort of waiting for Meghan to create these animals, and then you have them. And so what is that like? I mean, do you get like a sort of a dossier about them, or just, like a file, like Meghan says, like, here's what I got, or what's the handoff like there?
Yeah, it's actually a Word document, like 4 pages of text divided into different categories with regard to the kind of information, which suggested to me like a natural history one sheet that you might find like in a museum or a zoo or something in a gift shop. And so we actually created those for both. In fact, for the secret site that attendees get to access, you can access the the actual data in this kind of graphical information form. But she's creating the information while I'm just thinking about the novel, because I've over the years decided that I can never really write a novel too late, but I can write it too soon. So she's doing that, and I'm just letting ideas accrue and just putting them in a Word file until I have, in chronological order, maybe 30,000 words of text. And I think that's around the time that Meghan sent me both those entries. And then there was the issue of like, I didn't know what I was going to get. Like, it could be good information, but the way it was presented might not be right for the book, right? Mm-hmm. And as it turned out, it was brilliantly written. It was written in a style that I thought was a nice contrast to the style of the book, which is very important. I think the other thing, when a writer creates their own thing of this nature that they put into the text, it can sound too much like the other text that they've already written. So I wound up using a lot more of it than I thought I would. And because it was compelling, and because it epitomized what I wanted this to be, which is the contrast between the hummingbird's long migration and then the salamander, which it doesn't have a long migration, but basically feels so much through its skin, which is another thing that I think we also absorb a lot through our skins, but we don't really seem to understand that until years later when it's too late. So those two things I wanted in there. And then the other thing that was fascinating to me is that when I finally used the salamander information, I added a little bit of Jane's point of view to it, but I found a place to put it, I think, where it has an emotional resonance because of that fragileness of the salamander and its skin, and how that kind of thematically matches up with things that are going on in Jane's life. So sometimes it's also where you place information, depending on what the character's journey has been. The information can change radically and not be at all different in how it's stated. And so that's what I also tried to do.
Did having these two species sort of take the story in a kind of a new direction that you might not have had before, or did it kind of just sort of lock in place what that 30,000 words was already going in?
I think it definitely changed it, and I'll tell you why. Because if it had been just information, if it hadn't been compellingly conveyed, if there hadn't been, and you heard it from what Meghan said in terms of the things she embedded in the information that I would never have thought to put in there, the things you might think of on the simplest level as in jokes, but things also that are commentary. And so I think what happened was, originally I wasn't really intending Jane to kind of have her entry point to the mystery be the fact that she became enamored of the details of the hummingbird's life. And that only occurred because of the way I received the information. And that definitely would not have occurred if I had just researched it myself and used a real hummingbird. It just wouldn't have been the way it came about.
So Meghan, I mean, what was the process for you like? I mean, you come up with the species and then give it to Jeff. Do you sort of continue to work with them at later stages, or do you just like one day see the finished book with your Hummingbird Salamander in it? What happens after that handoff for you?
Yeah, I mean, the only restraint that I was given in developing the species was that the hummingbird had to be migratory and it needed to migrate to Argentina. So there were some things that I developed along the way that required some conversation with Jeff after I handed off the species. I remember a conversation about dwarfism and gigantism, and how that occurs and how that happens. So there was some science lessons along the way, and then I didn't read sections until it was a pretty late stage novel, and Jeff sent it to me, and I read it, and I loved it, and I gave Jeff a bunch of feedback about my reading of the novel, and that was concentrated on the biology parts of it, but there were also Jane and I are pretty different in terms of basically Jane is telling you about my species, and so there were moments where I was not quite sure, and so that was a really neat process. And maybe I will mention that when Jeff gave me that late stage in the novel, he said, there's something about the ending, and I'm not going to divulge what's happening at the ending. And I'm, contemplating this. And there was biology to put to work there. There was a solution that was already there in those, dossiers of species that I'd given him. And so it was really great to be able to engage with the novel in a way that because I was intimate with the species, I could get them to, play a slightly different role, a slight revision in that process.
Yeah, I would actually say that towards the end of the novel, there's a analysis that Meghan had with regard to aspects of the two created species that hardwired them even further into the novel in a way I would not have thought of. And it's hard to talk about because it would kind of be a spoiler, but I was really happy about that because there were a lot of really good reasons why they should be the creatures of this novel, but this hardwired it in a third or fourth way that I thought was really interesting. The other interesting thing was having a scientist read the novel and having to say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to change this fact because Jane, as a non-scientist, wouldn't really glom onto that. She really wouldn't get that. So I appreciated that oversight, though, because there were things that I would not have thought to question in the text. And so there were cases where I actually added things from Sylvina's point of view, from her journal entries, because of Meghan's comments, to kind of address the issue from a different direction than Jane's point of view.
One thing that I mean, again, I'm not going to give spoilers away, but just sort of, I was thinking a lot reading the book about sort of a tension that there is when we talk about the natural world and the state that it's in now, about hope and despair when you look at the state of things and where things are headed. You know, I'm sort of curious, you know, to hear from both of you about how you manage that in your respective work. I mean, you know, it's pretty common now for scientists who be, you know, who study species to be basically like chronicling their extinction, you know. And there are actually some where they've, you know, been studying a species for years and then it's just, they don't see it anymore and they're the ones who declare it extinct. And we're going to be seeing a lot more of that in the future. So, you know, I'm curious what it's like to sort of to on the one hand recognize the dire situation we're in. How do you balance sort of being realistic about what we're facing versus keeping hope, your own hope, or trying to offer hope to others, whether as a scientist or as a novelist who writes about the state of the natural world? I don't know. I don't know which one of you would like to take that on first, but I'm just curious about the two of you, I was just thinking about that a lot in the book because it's,
sure.
there is this incredible, you know, love of the details of nature in these two species and all those fine adaptations. But there's a lot in this book that's really bleak.
Well, I guess I'll take that first. But the thing about it too is that there's a bleakness that is a kind of like late night neon light kind of noir thriller kind of aspect. So to my mind, for thriller readers, that's kind of like the allure of this genre to some degree. So there's that aspect. There's the aspect that there are real hummingbirds and salamanders out there, you know, that are very close to the life cycles that Meghan describes, that need our help, that are still out there, you know, doing what they do. And I think that's where the hope lies, is that we're not in a world where I'm describing something where that entire, you know, class of species or whatever is gone. So I think that's something that I hope readers take from it, that beauty still exists in the world. It's also from the perspective that I have, which is I live in North Florida, which is one of the most biodiverse places in the world, is not deforested, has tons of biodiversity and complex systems to fight for. And I think that's also critical, because I don't actually think that we can delink green tech and sustainability from biodiversity. I think if we do that, we'll still not survive. So we have to fight for this. We have to also understand that our war on our ecosystems has been so great that it's not that nature is fragile, it's that we have been waging an all-out war on it. So if there's hope, it's that if we simply stop doing that to some degree, and can also get our handle on stopping the temperature increase, that we can get to a point where we still do have some level of biodiversity, because if we don't, we are going to be in real trouble. Also, I would say my daughter, Erin Kennedy, works for Metabolic, a company in Amsterdam that's been hugely successful, having cities become carbon neutral and doing amazing work in the environmental sphere. And she has the facts at her disposal. And as long as she has hope and she's out there in the world working for this stuff, then I do as well.
Right. Yeah. You know, Meghan, I'm curious your perspective. I mean, you know, you work in aquatic systems, which, you know, some of which are, you know, incredibly, there's a lot of pressure on them. And I'm wondering how much you're dealing with these issues, either directly with your work or just sort of, you know, just as a biologist, to kind of looking at sort of the state of the natural world more generally.
Yeah, I mean, it's a parallel to the book. In the book, there's a looming environmental crisis. And as a practicing ecologist, there is, a matter of course that you're dealing with environmental ills. So, most of us have gone into biology because we're fascinated, by these remarkable organisms and processes. And, you have to take into account things like, a climate collapse and nutrient pollution and contaminants, because when you're designing an experiment or interpreting results, you might actually be learning about that more than the thing that you set out to test. There's a truism, and I don't know the attribution, but when you're looking for a needle in the haystack, you get to know the hay. And so, you're studying something as a biologist, maybe you're interested in, the role of light in a species behavior. And what you end up learning about is the 2 summers you collected data. One was a drought summer and one was an unusually wet summer. So I think that duality of that sense of wonder and the environmental degradation creates this ecological empathy that has an emotional price. And that's one thing that I really love about Hummingbird Salamander and Jeff's other work and his peers, is that the novel gives us a place to dwell in that complexity of emotions. And, it gets at our nerves and our hearts and our brains. And as a scientist who typically writes to other scientists, that isn't a place I go. And it's never been a place I've been encouraged to go as a scientific writer. But I think, how we make sense of the extraordinary, something like the bee hummingbird, which actually does exist, or the, things that are not yet, but are things that could be actualized, like remediating, pollution in a wetland, is in part through being able to read and comprehend, the implausible and the paradoxical. And that is kind of where a lot of hope, rests for me when I'm grappling with something like global climate change, which has this, intellectually robust group of people working on and thinking about and puzzling about. And you also have a group of people that are rejecting that science as a legitimate course of action. So I really think that was one of the better experiences in working on the novel for me, was being able to really kind of become emotional to the species I was working on, knowing that they were fictitious. And I mean, you never know what Jeff is going to do with species that you evolve for him. But I was so pleased that in this fictional world that, as a product of, in part of these two species, that part of what happens is there is an element of getting more ecological empathy in the foreground.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that, scientists like yourself have, in a way, kind of an access to this awareness that the rest of us may not, because we don't spend, all our time, observing these things. And yet, scientists themselves are not trained or encouraged to share that so much. I mean, I for my latest book, Life's Edge, I wanted to write about, sort of extreme. One of the things was like, extremes of homeostasis, keeping your life in an inner balance. And I really got fascinated with bats, and I ended up going with some New York State biologists into a cave in winter in the Adirondacks, into an abandoned mine that they had been going to year in, year out, censusing bats, studying the bats, and trying to understand how they get through every winter. And which, and it's, on the one hand, it was such a wonderful experience because you'd see these exquisite little furry creatures just clinging to these cold rock walls, and they were going to be there for months, just doing nothing and yet surviving. So on the one hand, that's all nice and wonderful, David Attenborough type, but like there were a few dozen bats in this mine, and like they, if you look at their records, they were looking at thousands a couple decades ago, these same people. and the problem was that the white nose syndrome had hit. People had brought this fungus into the cave and all the other mines and caves in the area, and just to completely annihilated, forgive the pun, Jeff, all these bats. And so, but they're just like taking down the numbers and just doing their science. And meanwhile, I'm there just trying to hold it all in. It can be very intense when you really come face to face with that. So let me turn to some of the questions. Let's see. So someone asks, Jeff, I'll throw this to both of you. Do you see beings as individuals or as interconnected with each other, or both?
I think the last 3 years rewilding our yard has put me in such close proximity, in part because of the way the house is form fitted to this little ravine and the way the windows are, so that in addition to trail cams and everything else, I see a lot of individual animals on a daily basis. So, I know that every single raccoon in this ravine has a different personality and a different way of holding itself, and I know that certain cardinals act differently than other cardinals. And so for me, it's been a process of kind of tunneling down to the individual and then thinking about the individual and actually existing with these individuals, and then just kind of pondering that, and that will eventually come out in the fiction in ways different than it has in the past, I think, because of that.
Yeah. So Meghan, how do you think about the things that you study? I mean, are you looking at just individuals, or do you see them mainly as just like little nodes in that network?
Yeah, it depends on the question. If you're asking a question about a new species that has established, you might be interested in individual characteristics, being able to describe that species, understand its adaptation. But you also might be interested in a question that looks at a collection of individuals, population, to ask questions about it. So it really depends on your entry point, your hypothesis. And most ecologists specialize somewhere on a spectrum from thinking about individuals to thinking about the globe. We tend to maybe go up a step or down a step a little bit, but it's really hard for me not to be thinking about communities, and that's kind of the web that you're thinking about, that circuitry that's connecting organisms, because you're out there studying, and at the individual level it is being impacted by its an environment and the other organisms around it. And so most of my work has focused sort of at the community or population level.
Mm-hmm. Danny Redfern asks, this is for Jeff, if it is true that we write books first to take ourselves on the journey, how were you changed by writing it?
To be absolutely honest, in this one, I was kind of shaken to my core by writing the ending, because I didn't know what the ending was going to be until I wrote it. And I don't really know how to describe that yet. I'm still processing what that means. But sometimes you get to the end of a book and it's been a long journey, and you're already kind of you're tired. You're wanting to. You've had an endurance to get there. You're never really sure if you're going to finish a novel. In this particular case, the journey that Jane takes is kind of like that too. So there's this weird doubling of the character and my own situation, and finishing it at the, kind of into the pandemic and into the election stress that also kind of created that. But I don't know. I think that this is a book too that for me has to be talked about with spoilers. And so I'm waiting, I'm happy for after the trade paperback comes out to have a different conversation about what the book means and what it doesn't mean.
Fair enough.
Mm-hmm.
So Meghan, Eduardo asks, I believe it was mentioned at the start of the discussion that Professor Brown taught an environmental activism course with Annihilation on the syllabus. Were there particular nonfiction readings that were paired with Annihilation? Do either of you have ethical or political texts that you have found especially insightful given your own work and experiences?
Yeah, so the class that Jeff mentioned, it wasn't my class. It was a class in the environmental studies department. But I have used fiction in class. Most often I use it in kind of short excerpts, but Jeff inspired me to actually start assigning a flash fiction assignment in one of my upper level classes when he was here. So in upstate New York, we have a former Army depot that's fenced in, and part of the legacy of that Army depot is a group of white deer. They're white-tailed deer, but they lack pigment in the fur. And I had previously engaged a class with it. We had a debate about what to do. You know, the Army depot was no longer in existence. The land could go into conservation. It could go into development. And talking about the white deer, I thought, you know, wow, this would be an opportunity to actually engage some upper level students in fiction that typically think about science. And so the mythology around that deer, as you can imagine, is pretty extensive. And most people point to, you know, physics. You know, there was some, you know, nuclear warhead storage on the property, and that's how the white deer ended up, you know, white. And so I challenged my students to actually use ecology to figure these things out. So I do assign fiction, and when I do, of course, there's nonfiction in my classes that, you know, come with that pairing, and maybe offline we can chat about what some of those are. And, you know, I mean, Carl, that's a great thing that I want to say, is that there are so many science writers writing science to non-scientists or to amateur scientists. And those are so useful as teaching tools because, you know, I'm reading them as a professional scientist, and they're far more accessible than the typical dialogue that we have between scientists and the scientific literature. So definitely a shout out to your great work.
And just as a brief thing about the white deer, there's actually a white deer exercise in my creative writing book, because I think it's really important that fiction writers really consider all the implications of the setting that they're using, the history, the natural history, and everything else. And so this kind of fed into that as well.
Cool. Let's see. Okay, so Sean has a question for Jeff. I love that so many of your novels feature female protagonists, especially in a field often where, given the genre of Hummingbird Salamander, would be common male roles. Was there a specific individual or inspiration for writing such strong, powerful, and needed female representation?
Well, I mean, you know, I dedicate every book to my wife, Anne, who I think is extremely strong individual who for a long time worked in a male-dominated field. She was one of the first female programmers, women programmers in this area, and she would often go to conventions and be one of just a handful of women in the software development. And I know that took an incredible strength of will. And it's something that kind of gets transferred to Jane in her office politics workplace. But in general, you know, other than that, it's just also simply wanting to work against type. So with Annihilation, the characters didn't have anything, they didn't have names or anything. And the day after I thought up the idea, I woke up and realized they were all women. And I was very happy with that, because I'm so sick of the trope of, you know, a scientific expedition with one woman, or especially in film, then you see not only just one woman, but the one woman is dressed very differently than other scientists, let's say, and things like that. So, so definitely then my subconscious kind of being rewarded with Annihilation has continued to work in this way in terms of the characters that come out.
So Eugene Leonard has a question for Meghan. It's sort of a question and then a comment, so I'll just read the whole thing and then Meghan, you can answer. I know it's a super broad question, but what exactly first drew you to studying lake ecosystems? Beyond my question, I just want to say I'm pursuing a career in environmental epidemiology, so it's so easy to get bogged down with despair. I admire you both for driving home the fact that fighting isn't futile and that hope is never stupid. Thank you wholeheartedly for not feeding into the nihilism I constantly see while doom scrolling on Twitter. So So that being said, so Megan, what drew you to lakes?
Well, I grew up in northern Michigan. Lakes were a constant presence of my childhood, and I went off to college to become a medical doctor because that's what I, thought biologists and scientists did, even though I'd had, experiences with really remarkable biology teachers along the way that were more naturalists than, folks that were interested in human health. And I got to college and I took a variety of classes and loved most of them, and ended up in a lake ecology class that just rocked my world. I all of a sudden saw this pairing between something that I had a natural affinity to and something that there was, a wealth of work that had been done and studied. And it was, immediate that I thought this is definitely what I want to go on to study. So I was always drawn to that aquatic world, but it took, a quarter of a lifetime to get me to realize that that's where I would also spend my time working.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if this is a question for you, Megan, or for you, Jeff. You guys can take it as you see fit. Madison asks, how did you develop the extinction history of the hummingbird? Did you draw from real world anthropogenic extinctions like the ivory-billed woodpecker? So you're creating these species, and then you're putting them being exposed to sort of the human pressure. So how did you work on that aspect of them?
Yeah, for both species, there were things sprinkled in the information that I gave Jeff about what might be the challenges that organism is facing due to anthropogenic changes, due to human changes. And I'm going to be vague here intentionally for folks that aren't, far along in the book. But you have this hummingbird that has to have this amazing feat every year migrating between the Pacific Northwest and Argentina. And so it's grappling with that. You also have an organism that is, basically consuming a sugar diet that needs to be constant. And it's also highly paired with the flora that is present in that particular environment. So there are some things when you get on the secret site that has more detail that you might think, oh, is that in the novel, or is this how it works? But I'm going to kind of leave it there, that there were several paths that the species could go down in terms of an extinction path. And same for the salamander.
Okay, great. Jeff, someone asks, I enjoy how there is, well, let me sort of, okay, I'll start at the beginning. I'm really loving this 10 second in the future novel, but I really, really love Speck from A Peculiar Peril. Speck is the only mote with a personality I've ever come across. Thank you for Speck, and also for Shovel Pig in this novel. I enjoy how there is playfulness with objects in your work. Lampshed cabinet of curiosities, how Bourne collected clothes, and so on. Can you talk about how you treat stuff in your book? So we've been talking a lot about animals, so
yeah.
just
okay.
What about stuff?
Speck in my YA novel Peculiar Peril is a kind of magical object that has a kind of really quite a sense of humor. And my thought was that magical objects in this world would be alive, so they would almost be like creatures. And I thought that'd be hilarious, that you're searching for something that doesn't want to be found on this quest. But I actually think that backgrounds of settings should do a lot more work sometimes than they sometimes do in novels. So, for example, in Bourne, it's very calculated what clothing Bourne disguises himself in, because it's the clothing clearly of someone who has died. And that kind of gives you a perspective on what is happening in this world. And the same thing with Shovel Pig. I mean, Shovel Pig is Jane's purse, and she calls it that because behind her back, male co-workers call this giant purse Shovel Pig. And so it's her way of kind of reclaiming it and saying, I don't give a shit what you call it, So all of this has some kind of other meaning. It becomes characterization, basically. And so I work really hard to make sure that, even the most throw off detail in the backdrop that may not even come into focus like Shovel Pig does, actually is doing some additional work.
Just a very, very practical little question. We've been referring to the secret site. Can you, Luther Richardson is asking where you can find it.
Oh, yeah. It's just if you go to unitopia.live, and the password is Unitopia now, and I'll put that in the chat too. And there's a ton of extras there if you haven't already gone there.
Great. Excellent. And I think Dave Brown has a very good last question here. Hummingbird versus salamander, who wins? Both of you.
This is actually a family and a friend debate. Having invented these two species is which one would win. And, I always give the answer that it depends on the environment that you presented them and what challenge you present to them. If it involves flight being, a useful characteristic, then the hummingbird wins. But if it involves being able to be subterranean and hide in leaf litter, the salamander gets to win. So I can't pick.
Well, in this case, I would just briefly say that I would pick salamander, and it's in part because one bit of research I did do is on the mythic giant salamanders of North California. There's still this kind of mythos that in extreme areas of the Kings Range and other areas, that there may be huge megafauna salamanders that are just too remote for people to get to. And I love the idea of these little Shangri-Las of places with species that we haven't discovered. So I'd like putting that detail in the novel.
Excellent. Well, this has been a great hour of conversation. Thank you all for questions. And thanks for Booksmith for having us.
Thanks very much, Carl.
Thank you all so much. Everyone's going to really enjoy the secret site. There's so much there to enjoy and just dig out all the little extras. So thank you.
Sure.
Good night, everyone.
Bye. Good
Bye.
night.
Thank you.